The moment Cyrus Underwood walked into the Millhaven grain barn on the night of the harvest social, he told himself he would stand by the wall, eat a piece of pie, and leave before anyone tried to pull him onto the floor. He had made this exact promise to himself every autumn for the past 6 years, ever since he had taken over the Underwood homestead after his father's passing, and every year he had kept it without much difficulty. The wall was comfortable. The pie was good. The leaving was easy. Cyrus was a man who had mastered the art of watching life happen to other people. The year was 1883, and the town of Millhaven, Kansas sat on the flat, windswept edge of the prairie like a handful of dry bones someone had scattered and forgotten. It was not a beautiful town by any measure a poet might use, but it was honest, and it worked hard. And in September, when the harvest came in and the nights turned cool, and the smell of cut wheat drifted through every open door and window, it could feel, just briefly, like the center of the world. Cyrus was 28 years old. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches in his worn leather boots, with dark hair that he kept too long because he never quite got around to the barber, and brown eyes that people described, when they described him at all, as steady. He was not unfriendly. He just did not make much of himself. He ran his 160 acres alone, kept 2 horses and a small herd of cattle, grew winter wheat, and paid his debts on time. He was the kind of man a town was grateful to have without ever quite thinking about him. He had never danced. Not once. Not as a child, not as a young man, not at any of the previous 6 harvest socials. His mother had tried to teach him when he was 12, and he had stepped on her feet 3 times in as many minutes, and she had laughed and told him he would find his feet someday. And then she had died the following winter of a fever that swept through the county with no mercy and no apology, and the dancing lesson had remained unfinished. He carried that small incompletion, the way a man carries a stone in his boot that is not quite sharp enough to stop him walking but is always there. He took his usual position near the right wall of the barn, where Hank Bellard had set out a long table with pies and molasses cake and a crock of sweet cider. The barn was lit with oil lanterns hanging from the rafters, and the warm amber light turned everything golden and slightly unreal. Thomas Greer and his 2 sons had set up on the low platform at the far end with a fiddle, a guitar, and a squeeze box, and they were already playing something lively enough that the first brave couples were spinning out onto the swept floorboards. Cyrus poured himself a tin cup of cider and leaned against the post and watched. He noticed her because she walked in alone. That was not common in Millhaven in 1883. Women came to socials with their husbands or their fathers or their brothers, or at the very least a sister or a friend. They came in clusters and pairs. They came anchored. This woman came in the door by herself, with a brown wool coat over her arm and a dress the color of deep blue autumn sky, and she looked around the barn with the steady, assessing gaze of someone who had arrived somewhere new and was making a private calculation about whether it was worth staying. She was not from Millhaven. Cyrus knew every face in this town, and this face was not one of them. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark auburn hair pinned up but already losing a few strands to the evening, and a quality of self-possession about her that made her seem taller than she was, though she was not short. Her eyes, even from across the barn, caught the lantern light and held it. Cyrus looked away. He drank his cider. He looked back. She had moved toward the cider table. She was close enough now that he could have spoken to her if he were the kind of man who spoke easily to strangers. He was not. "Is this the only cider?" she asked, not exactly to him, but near enough that it would have been rude to pretend she had not spoken. "Or is there something a person might drink that is less sweet?" "That is the only cider," Cyrus said. "Martha Finch makes it. She is proud of the sweetness." The woman looked into her cup and then looked at him. "I see. Well, I have survived worse." "Are you passing through Millhaven, or—" "I have just arrived," she said. "Lydia Cooper. I am the new schoolteacher." Cyrus straightened slightly from his lean against the post. "The new schoolteacher," he repeated. "We have been waiting on one since Miss Haverson went to Topeka in the spring." "I know. The letter from the school board was very detailed about how long they had been waiting. A small, dry note in her voice, not unkind, just sharp in the way of someone who sees things clearly and does not bother to sand the edges. I am told I should have come in summer, but the family I was with in Missouri could not spare me until August, and then there was the matter of the wagon breaking down twice on the road from Dodge, so here I am, 3 weeks into the school term, and the children have apparently been running wild. They have, Cyrus confirmed. Billy Harmon nailed the schoolhouse door shut from the inside last Wednesday. She blinked. Nailed it. With proper nails. He got the hammer from his father's shed. We do not know how he got it past his mother. A laugh escaped her then, quick and unguarded, and she pressed her fingers to her lips as though surprised by it. Well, she said when she had composed herself, I have handled worse than Billy Harmon, I expect. I expect you have, Cyrus said. He did not know what made him say the next thing. He was not a man who said things like this. But the barn was warm and the fiddle was sweet, and there was something about her standing there with her cup of Martha Finch's too sweet cider and her composed, straight-shouldered dignity that made something in his chest pull sideways. Cyrus Underwood, he said. I run the wheat farm on the North Road, past the Miller place. She looked at him with something that was not quite a smile, but contained the materials for one. Are there many people here I should know about, Mr. Underwood? Most of them, he said. I can tell you who is friendly and who is not, who bakes what for which occasion, and which men on the town council are honest. That is probably the most useful information. Tell me about the town council first, she said immediately, and Cyrus found himself smiling, which was not a thing he did often or easily, and it felt strange on his face, like a muscle remembering a movement it had not tried in some time. He told her about the town council. He told her about the families whose children she would be teaching. He told her that Reverend Stokes was kind, and that Dr. Aldridge was competent, and that the general store owner, a man named Perth, would try to overcharge her for lamp oil until she established herself as someone who tracked prices, at which point he would become scrupulously fair. She listened to all of it with her head slightly tilted and her eyes attentive, asking precise questions that told him she was already organizing the information into something useful. She was going to be a very good teacher, he thought, the kind who understood that preparation was not the same as worry. Thomas Greer and his sons shifted into a waltz, one of the slower, more formal pieces they played when the older couples wanted to take the floor. The barn settled into a different rhythm. The oil lanterns swayed in the draft from the open doors, and the golden light shifted and breathed. Do you dance, Mr. Underwood? Lydia asked. He had been asked this before. He always said no in a way that discouraged follow-up. He opened his mouth to do exactly that. I do not, he said. I never have. She turned to look at him fully then, with an expression that was not pity and not amusement, but something in between, like genuine curiosity. Never. Not once in my life. How old are you? 28. 28 years and never danced. She said it like she was taking the measure of a thing. Was there a reason, or did it simply never happen? He thought about his mother. He thought about the stone in the boot. My mother tried to teach me when I was a child, he said. I was not very good at it, then she passed and I never got back to it. Something in her expression shifted. The precise, assessing quality softened. I am sorry, she said quietly, about your mother. It was a long time ago. That does not always make it smaller. No, Cyrus thought, it does not. They were quiet for a moment. On the floor, couples turned and turned under the amber lanterns, and the fiddle made its long, aching voice across the warm air. I could teach you, Lydia said. He looked at her. One evening, she said. Right now, in fact. I taught dancing to the children of the family I worked for in Missouri. I am a fair teacher, I am told, and the waltz is not complicated. The basic step is 3 counts. It is mostly about listening to the music and trusting your feet. I do not trust my feet. Then trust mine, she said simply, and she held out her hand. He looked at her hand. It was a capable hand, steady and unhesitating, offered with the straightforward confidence of someone who did not make offers they did not mean. The lantern light fell across it. Around them, Millhaven danced and laughed and smelled of hay and cider, and the particular sweetness of a harvest brought safely in. Cyrus Underwood had stood by walls for 6 years. He took her hand. Her palm was warm against his. She was looking up at him with patient, steady eyes, and she stepped back and drew him with her toward the edge of the dancing area, not into the thick of it, just to a slightly open space near the side where they would not be in anyone's way. "All right," she said. "The waltz counts in 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Listen to the music and you will hear it." He listened. He heard it. "Your right hand goes here," she said, and placed his hand against her waist. The blue wool of her dress was soft under his fingers. "My right hand is in your left, and we begin on the 1." He stepped on her foot immediately. "That is fine," she said, without flinching. Again. He stepped on her foot a second time. "That is also fine. You are thinking about your feet instead of the music. Listen." He listened. The fiddle rose and fell, 3 beats and 3 beats and 3 beats, a long, gentle wave of sound, and something in his body started to find it. Something started to understand the difference between this beat and the next one, started to feel the space opening on the 1 and closing on the 3. "There," she said, and her voice was warm and quiet close to him. "You have it." He did not quite have it yet, but he had the beginning of it, which was more than he had ever had before. They moved slowly, cautiously, and he stepped on her foot once more and apologized, and she told him to stop apologizing and focus on the music. And he focused on the music. And then for a few bars, 4 or 5, something happened. His feet found the beat and his body found the space, and Lydia was moving with him and not against him, and it was not graceful, but it was dancing. It was unmistakably, actually dancing. He nearly stopped in surprise. "Do not stop," she said. "You will lose it." He did not stop. They danced through that waltz and the beginning of the next one. People around them were paying attention, he realized. Faces he knew were glancing over with expressions that ranged from surprise to open delight. Hank Bellard at the cider table was grinning broadly. Old Martha Finch had her hands clasped together like she was watching something that pleased her very much. Cyrus kept his eyes on Lydia because looking at her was easier than thinking about who was watching. She was watching him with attention and encouragement, making small adjustments, telling him quietly when to step left instead of right, correcting without criticism. "You are doing well," she said. "I am doing adequately," he said. "There is a difference." She smiled at that, the full smile this time, not the contained one. It did something to the available air in the barn. "Adequate is how everyone begins," she said. "It becomes well with practice. I have had 28 years of not practicing." "Then you have a great deal of catching up to do," she said. "We had better keep going." They kept going. The social went on around them. The Thomas Greer family played for 2 more hours, and in those 2 hours Cyrus Underwood danced more than he had danced in his entire preceding life. He learned the waltz well enough to stop counting out loud, which Lydia told him was a significant milestone. He attempted a schottische and managed it poorly, but with enough enthusiasm that she declared it a partial success. He tried a polka and stepped on her feet twice and on his own feet once, which made her laugh again, that quick, unguarded laugh, and the sound of it went somewhere into him and stayed. Between dances they talked. She told him she had grown up in Indiana, that her father had been a schoolteacher himself and her mother a seamstress, that both of them had passed when she was 19, a fever the same as his mother, and that she had made her own way since then, first in Indiana and then in Missouri and now here. "Were you not afraid to come so far?" he asked. "I was afraid to stay," she said. That seemed worse. He understood that. He understood it in his bones. She asked him about the farm, and he found himself telling her things he did not usually tell anyone, about the satisfaction of watching wheat come up in the spring, about the loneliness of the long winter months, about the way the prairie looked at dawn in July when the light came horizontal across the flat land, and the wheat caught it and turned to gold. "You should write that down," she said. "What?" "The way you just described that, the July light. You have a poet's way of seeing, Mr. Underwood." "No one has ever told me that." Perhaps they were not listening carefully. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. The fiddle had gone quiet for a brief rest, and the barn was full of the sound of conversation and laughter, and the distant lowing of cattle from outside. Her face was flushed from dancing, a strand of dark auburn hair across her cheek, and she was looking at him with those steady eyes that held the lantern light. And Cyrus Underwood had the distinct and vertiginous sensation that something was happening to him that had no precedent in his experience, and that he did not know how to name. He wanted to name it. He found he did not yet have the words. "I should greet more of the town," Lydia said, after a moment. "I understand that making myself known is important in the first weeks." "It is," he said. "It matters. Will you introduce me to some of the families, the ones whose children will be in my school?" "I will." He spent the next hour walking through the barn with her at his side, making introductions with more ease than he was accustomed to, because having a purpose helped, because having someone beside him who was genuinely, unself-consciously interested in every person she met made the people real in a way that small talk at a social never usually managed. He watched her kneel down to talk to the Harmon children at eye level. He watched her ask Widow Beaumont about her late husband's name, because someone had mentioned him, and hold the old woman's hands while she answered. He watched her tell George Perth that she was very glad Millhaven had a well-stocked general store, and that she would be in on Monday for lamp oil. And the way she said it was so pleasant and so precisely indicating that she was a woman who knew her own business that Perth straightened his collar and said he would make sure to have plenty on hand. Cyrus watched all of this and felt something in him settling into a certainty that was entirely new. Late in the evening, when the social was winding toward its end and families were gathering coats and children and making their ways to wagons, Lydia collected her brown wool coat from the chair where she had laid it and put it on, and she turned to Cyrus with the straightforward look he was already beginning to think of as distinctly hers. "Thank you for the introduction to the town," she said, "and for dancing with me." "I stepped on your feet 4 times, he said. 3 times, she corrected. "The last one was a near miss. Thank you," he said, "for teaching me." She nodded and she looked at him for a moment, and there was something in the look that he thought might mean she was calculating whether to say something more, the way she had looked around the barn when she first walked in and was deciding whether it was worth staying. And then she said, "I will see you at church on Sunday, I expect, if you attend." "I attend," he said. "Good," she said. "Good night, Mr. Underwood. Good night, Miss Cooper." He watched her walk out of the barn into the September night, and then he stood there for a moment in the amber light with the sound of the fiddle fading and the smell of hay and cider around him, and he felt the stone in his boot was no longer there. He did not sleep much that night. He lay in the dark of his farmhouse with the September wind moving against the window glass and thought about everything she had said, replaying it with the careful attention he usually applied to weather patterns and soil conditions. He thought about the waltz. He thought about her hand in his, warm and steady. He thought about her laugh. He rose at his usual hour before dawn, dressed, fed his horses and his cattle, made coffee on the iron stove, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the flat, dark land while the coffee heated and the sky began very slowly to go gray and then pink, and then the particular amber gold of a Kansas September dawn. He thought, "I'm going to make a fool of myself over that woman." And then he thought, perhaps that is all right. Sunday came. He put on his good shirt and his church coat, which he kept clean and pressed for Sundays, because his mother had asked that of him, and it had never seemed worth unasking, and he rode into town on his roan horse, Caleb, tied up at the hitching post outside the white clapboard church, and went in. Lydia was already seated 3 rows from the front on the left side, which was where single women usually sat. She had her dark auburn hair pinned up neatly and a blue-gray dress that was not the harvest social blue, but had the same quality of being both practical and dignified. She did not look up when he came in, but she would have heard the door. He sat in his usual pew. He was aware of her 3 rows ahead, and to the left for the entirety of Reverend Stokes's sermon, which was about sowing and harvest and thankfulness for abundance, which was the sermon Reverend Stokes gave every year at this time, and which was a good sermon for that reason. Cyrus heard about 40% of it. Afterward, on the steps in the October cool, he found himself next to her in the way that happened when you were looking for someone without wanting to appear to be looking for them, and found them because they were perhaps doing the same. "Good sermon," she said. "He gives it every year," Cyrus said. "It improves with familiarity." "Like dancing," she said. "Like dancing," he agreed. She smiled. "How are your feet this morning?" "Well rested," he said. "How are yours?" "Surviving," she said with that dry warmth, and then Dr. Aldridge was there to greet her, and Martha Finch had questions about the school schedule, and the morning's social obligation took over. But before it did, when she was turning away, she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "I will be at the schoolhouse every evening this week after the children leave, getting it in order. If you happen to be in town." He happened to be in town on Tuesday. He had a legitimate reason. He needed to pick up fence wire at Perth's, which was true, and he needed to drop off a payment at the land office, which was also true, and if his route back to the North Road took him past the schoolhouse, that was simply geography. The schoolhouse door was open, and the sound of it from the road was someone moving furniture, dragging something heavy across a wooden floor. He stopped Caleb at the hitching post and went in. Lydia had pushed one of the long student benches against the wall and was in the process of trying to move a second one, which was proving difficult because it was heavier than it looked, and she was attempting to push it from one end while it pivoted instead of sliding. "Let me," Cyrus said. She looked up, not surprised exactly, but pleased in a way she was keeping measured. "Mr. Underwood, what are we doing? I want more floor space in the front for demonstrations. The benches can go along the sides." She pointed. He picked up his end of the bench. She picked up hers. They moved it to where she indicated, and then the other bench, and then a heavy teacher's desk that took both of them and some maneuvering. Then there were shelves to be sorted, books to be organized by level, a blackboard that needed washing, a supply of chalk that needed to be found and had been lodged behind a loose board under the window, put there by Billy Harmon, almost certainly. They worked for an hour and a half and talked while they worked, which was the best kind of talking, Cyrus had always thought, the kind where you had something to do with your hands, so the talking was easy because neither person was just sitting looking at the other person carrying the full weight of a conversation. She told him about the school in Missouri, which had been in a wealthy household and nothing like this. She told him her ideas about teaching, which were specific and thought through and slightly unconventional, involving more time outdoors and more practical application than rote memorization. She told him she thought the children of farmers should learn to read weather patterns and soil conditions and basic arithmetic of acreage and yield, not just the classics, though the classics had their place. "That is what my father taught," she said. "He said you teach people what they need in the life they are actually living." "He was right," Cyrus said. She looked at him from across the freshly organized bookshelf. "You sound certain. My father taught me to read a field the same way he taught me to read a ledger." "Both mattered equally in the end." "And who taught you to appreciate the July light?" she asked. He had not expected that. That she had held that, remembered it from Saturday night. He was quiet for a moment. "I think that was my own doing," he said. "You notice things when you spend a lot of time alone." "Does it not get lonely?" she asked. It was a direct question, not unkind, just honest in that way of hers. "Yes," he said. "It does." She nodded, and she did not push it further, but something in the room had shifted, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them moved to change the subject. The afternoon light was coming low through the schoolhouse windows, golden and long the way Prairie September afternoons get when the summer is finally letting go, and it fell across the sorted shelves and the washed blackboard and the carefully rearranged benches, and Lydia Cooper was standing in the middle of it with chalk dust on her sleeve, and a satisfaction in her face that was entirely genuine, and Cyrus thought again, "I am going to be completely lost over this woman." He walked her to the boarding house where she was staying, the Hartwell place on Main Street, because the evening was going dark and he had Caleb to take back anyway and the route went that way, and she did not seem to think it required comment, just fell into step beside him on the board sidewalk. At the gate she said, "Thank you for the help. Thank you for the use of your schoolhouse," he said. She looked at him with the calculating look. "I am going to take the children on a nature walk along the creek on Thursday if the weather holds, to study the fall vegetation. You know this land better than I do. Would you be available to come and tell them what you know about the plants and the soil?" It was an invitation that was also something else, wrapped carefully in practicality. "I believe I could arrange that," Cyrus said. "Good," she said. "The children leave at 3 o'clock Friday. We would go Thursday, so I mean tomorrow." "All right," he said. "Good night, Mr. Underwood. Good night, Miss Cooper." He rode home in the early dark with the stars beginning to come out over the flat land, and he was smiling in the dark like a man who does not know he is smiling. Thursday morning, he was at the schoolhouse by 9, which was when the class began. He had not been asked to come at 9. He had been asked to come for the walk, but he arrived at 9, with a sack of apples from his orchard for the children and a general air of a man who had legitimate business nearby and had just stopped by. Lydia looked at the sack of apples and then at him and said nothing, but the corners of her mouth did what they did when she was not yet releasing the full smile. She introduced him to the class as Mr. Underwood, a farmer from the North Road who knew a great deal about the land around Millhaven. There were 11 children, ages ranging from about 6 to 14. He recognized most of them. Billy Harmon was in the back row, a square-built 9-year-old with the preemptively innocent look of a child who has been in trouble and expects to be in trouble again. Lydia taught the morning class. He sat at the back and watched, and it was immediately clear that she was extraordinary at this. She had the rare quality of making children feel that what they were learning mattered, that it was connected to something real and important. She asked questions more than she lectured. She listened to wrong answers with respect before gently redirecting. When Billy Harmon said something deliberately disruptive, she handled it with a calm directness that removed all entertainment from the act and left Billy with nothing to perform against, which was, Cyrus thought, exactly the right strategy. After the noon break, they took the class to the creek. Cyrus walked alongside the children and told them about the cottonwood trees and the prairie grass, and which plants came from seeds that traveled on the wind, and which ones relied on water, and why the soil near the creek was darker and richer than the soil farther up the bank. He showed them how to read the way the grass was bent to tell which direction the prevailing wind ran. He showed them a fox track in the soft mud and a beaver's mark on a tree trunk near the water. The children were delighted by all of it. Billy Harmon, in particular, was completely engaged, because it turned out Billy Harmon's interest in causing trouble was directly proportional to his boredom, and tracking foxes was not boring. Lydia walked beside him and listened with the same attentive quality she brought to everything. At one point he was explaining to a small girl named Clara the way the creek ran lower in late summer, and what that told you about the snowpack of the previous winter, and he looked up and found Lydia watching him with an expression that he did not know how to read exactly, but that made his entire chest feel too full. "You are very good with them," she said quietly, while the children were occupied at the water's edge. "I just know the land," he said. "You also know how to make someone feel that what they are hearing is worth hearing," she said. "That is the harder skill." He wanted to say something back. He had the beginning of something in his mind, something about how she had made him feel that way Saturday night, about dancing, about teaching someone new things without making them feel foolish for not knowing. He started to say it, and then several of the children came running back demanding to know if the beaver was still nearby, and the moment dissolved. On the walk back, as the children ranged ahead, she said, "I want to ask you something, and you may say no if you prefer." He felt his pulse do something unusual. "All right. There is a church supper on Friday evening, the kind where everyone brings a dish and it becomes a long evening of the whole town sitting together. I know you know this because you know everything about Millhaven," a brief dry note. I would like to attend, and I find it is still somewhat uncomfortable to walk into large gatherings where you are new. I thought, since you have already introduced me to half the town, whether you might." She stopped. "I am not asking you to, I mean to say. I am asking simply whether you would be my escort in the practical sense, walking me there, making introductions, not as anything, that is, not as—" "Yes," Cyrus said. She blinked. "Yes, I would be glad to escort you to the church supper," he said, and his voice was steady even though nothing inside him was. She let out a breath. "Good, thank you." "I am sorry, I am not accustomed to asking. I am not accustomed to being asked," he said honestly. "I think we are well matched in that regard." She looked at him sidelong, and whatever she was thinking showed briefly in her eyes before she looked forward again, and they walked back toward the schoolhouse with the children ahead of them, and the late afternoon light long and golden behind. The church supper was on Friday, and it was everything a church supper in Millhaven was, which was to say, long, loud, warm, and full of casseroles. Cyrus arrived at the Hartwell boarding house at 6 o'clock, and Lydia came down in a green dress with her hair pinned up and a shawl against the October cool, and she looked at him in his good shirt and church coat and said, "You dressed up." "You dressed up," he said. "Touché," she said, in a tone that was pleased. They walked to the church together. He introduced her to the remaining families he had not gotten to at the social. She brought a dish of roasted turnips and potatoes, which was simple and honest, and people appreciated it the way they appreciate simplicity and honesty in any form. She sat next to Widow Beaumont for part of the evening, and next to the Greer family for another part, and she was engaged and genuine everywhere. Cyrus watched her work the room and felt a complicated thing, pride, which surprised him, because she was not his to be proud of, and something more like awe, which surprised him less. And underneath both of those things the constant, low, warm awareness of her that had been operating in him since Saturday night and showed no signs of diminishing. After the supper, walking back through the dark October streets, the temperature had dropped and she pulled her shawl closer, and he thought about offering her his coat and decided to offer it, and she said no thank you, but the fact of the offer made her smile. "You have been very kind to me since I arrived," she said. "You did not have to be." "I know," he said. "Most people in a new town are perfectly pleasant, and yet somehow you still feel alone," she said. "You have not made me feel that way." He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him, and the lamplight from the hardware store window fell between them. "Lydia," he said, and the use of her first name without the miss was something neither of them had done yet, and it hung in the air between them with a particular weight. She did not correct him. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly, if you would permit it." The October dark was quiet around them. Somewhere down the street a horse shifted at a hitching post. "I would permit it," she said. "Is Sunday afternoon agreeable?" "Sunday afternoon is agreeable," she said. He nodded. She nodded. They started walking again, and they were quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that is fuller than most conversation. At the gate of the Hartwell place, she turned and looked at him with the direct, steady look that was becoming the thing he looked for more than any other thing in the world. "Good night, Cyrus," she said. He smiled. He could not help it. "Good night, Lydia." He rode home on Caleb under a sky thick with stars, and he talked to the horse for the entire 4 miles, which he did not usually do. And Caleb's ears moved forward and back in the attentive way of a horse who is listening without judging, which Cyrus appreciated enormously. Sunday afternoon, he brought her the last apples of the season from his orchard, because flowers were not the season but apples were, and they sat on the porch of the Hartwell boarding house and drank tea that Mrs. Hartwell brought out, because Mrs. Hartwell was that kind of landlady. And they talked for 3 hours while the October sun moved across the porch boards and the prairie wind moved through the cottonwood at the corner of the street. She told him more about Indiana, about her father's school, a small one-room building outside a town called Greenfield, and the way she had grown up in the back corner doing her own schoolwork while her father taught the other children, and how that had made learning feel like something you did alongside life rather than apart from it. She told him about her mother's seamstress shop and the smell of good wool, and the particular satisfaction of a clean seam. She told him she had two older brothers, both living in different states now, both with families of their own, and that she wrote to them regularly, but that they were different from her in the way that siblings sometimes are, living closer to the ground, practical in a way that did not include ambition beyond the immediate. "And you are ambitious," he said. "I am," she said without apology. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "I think it is one of your best things." She looked at him for a moment with something open and warm in her eyes. "You say the unexpected thing," she said. "Most men in 1883 in Kansas hear a woman say she is ambitious and they become uncertain." "I have been uncertain about a great many things in my life," Cyrus said. "I am not uncertain about this." "About what specifically?" she asked. It was not a game. She was asking for clarity, which was how she operated. He was learning in everything. He thought about how to say it honestly. "About the fact that you are extraordinary," he said, "and that I find you to be so, and that I am glad you came to Millhaven." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the apple in her hands, turning it slowly. "I am glad too," she said. He called on her the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. He came to the schoolhouse twice more during October with things to contribute to her lessons. A piece of fossilized stone he had found in the creek bank years ago and kept on his windowsill. A careful diagram he had drawn of the property boundaries and the water sources in the area around Millhaven, which she used to teach the children about geography and land use. She came to see the farm once, on a Saturday in late October when the sky was that particular deep blue of the late-year plains, and the wheat stubble was gold in the cut fields. He showed her the house, which was clean and spare, the kind of house a solitary man keeps with a certain pride but no particular softness. He showed her the barn and introduced her to his horses, the roan Caleb and a gray mare named Agnes, and she fed Agnes an apple core, and Agnes accepted it with the equine grace of a horse who knows her own value. He showed her the field where the winter wheat was coming in, thin green rows against the dark soil, and she asked how far down the roots went, and whether the snow would help or hurt it, and he answered each question with the pleasure of a man who knows his subject well and has rarely been asked about it. "You love this land," she said, standing at the edge of the field with the wind moving her shawl. "Yes," he said. "I understand it now," she said. "The July light. I can imagine it from here." He looked at the field and then at her and said, "I think this might be better than the July light." She turned to look at him. "October," he said, "with company." She looked at him for a long, clear moment, and then she stepped forward and took his hand the way she had taken it at the harvest social, steady and deliberate. And this time they were not going to dance, and they were not in a warm barn, but on the edge of a winter wheat field in the October wind, and he held her hand in both of his, and the world was very quiet. "Cyrus," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it is soon." "I am not saying it is too soon," she said. "I am saying it is real, which is not the same thing." "Is it real for you?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "It is rather alarmingly real for me." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I am glad, because I do not have the words for what I have been since the night at the social." "I stepped on your toes that night," she said. "You did not," he said. "That was entirely me." "Once," she said. "I stepped on yours once. I was not going to tell you." He laughed then, a full laugh, and she laughed too, and they stood at the edge of his winter wheat field in the October wind laughing, and he was still holding her hand in both of his. And this was, he thought, the best moment of his adult life, which was saying a great deal and also barely enough. In November the weather turned serious, the way Kansas weather does, not gradually but all at once. A hard northern wind one day that brought the temperature down 20 degrees and did not bring it back up. The flat land went gray and the cottonwoods lost their leaves, and the sky became a low, pale, pressing thing. Cyrus had work to do. There was always work to do on a farm in November: the winterizing, the mending of equipment, the putting up and preserving and preparing for the cold months. He did it with his usual methodical care, and he found that the work was different now, that it had a different quality, because there was something he was working toward, something he was building his life around, and that something had a face and a name, and a way of holding her head when she was listening carefully to something. He came into town every Thursday, ostensibly for various practical reasons that were generally true. In practice, because Thursday was the day Lydia ended her school week at the schoolhouse at 3 o'clock and was available for the rest of the afternoon before the Hartwell supper at 6. They fell into a Thursday routine. Tea on the Hartwell porch until the cold made that impractical, then at a table inside with Mrs. Hartwell tactfully elsewhere. They talked about everything. About books, because she had a set of them in a small trunk she had brought from Missouri, Scott and Dickens, and a battered Shakespeare, and several volumes on natural history and botany. He had never read much for pleasure, only practical things, and she began lending him books and they would discuss them the following Thursday, and he found, to his surprise, that he had opinions about things he had not known he had opinions about. Dickens particularly. He found Dickens funny in a way that seemed to please her very much. She had been in Millhaven for 2 months when the trouble happened. It was a Saturday evening in November, and Cyrus was in town for supplies, loading fence wire and lamp oil and a sack of winter flour onto his wagon, when he heard raised voices from the direction of the land office. He tied off his load and went to see, because he had learned years ago that raised voices near the land office in a Kansas town in the 1880s were often worth attending to. There were 3 men. 2 of them were the Lester brothers, Cal and Roy, who ran a neighboring operation to the west of Millhaven. The third was a man Cyrus did not know, a heavy-set man with a deputy's badge who had come up from the county seat for something. The argument was about a contested claim on the strip of land between the Lester property and the common grazing land east of town, and it was the kind of argument that had been building for longer than this particular Saturday, and was now spilling into the street with the particular intensity of a thing finally overflowing its container. Cyrus did not involve himself. This was the wisdom of the Prairie. You knew which disputes were yours and which ones were not, and you stayed clear of what was not yours because the range could turn dangerous when property was the subject. And 1883 was not so far from the years when that kind of thing ended with someone's cattle shot or someone's barn on fire. He finished loading his wagon and drove the long way back through town rather than past the land office, and he was 2 blocks from the road home when he saw Lydia coming out of the general store with a basket of groceries. He stopped the wagon. She looked up and saw him. "I heard the argument from inside Perth's," she said. "What is it about?" he told her. She listened with her head tilted in that way. "The Lester brothers have been losing that argument for 2 years," he added. "The survey was done in 1881 and the findings were clear. They just do not like the findings." "Men rarely like findings that go against them," she said. "They do not," he agreed. "Do you need a ride back to Hartwell's? Your basket looks heavy." "It is," she said. "Thank you." He climbed down and took the basket and handed her up to the wagon seat, and she settled there with the comfortable competence of someone who had grown up in places where wagons were the primary transportation, and he climbed up beside her and clucked Caleb forward. They were halfway up Main Street when she said, "I have been asked to a gathering at Reverend Stokes's house next Saturday. A small dinner, 6 or 8 people. He asked if I was bringing a guest." Cyrus kept his eyes on the road. "And what did you say?" "I said I was not sure yet," she said, and there was a note in her voice that was the very exact and deliberate neutrality of someone who is leaving a door open with intention. "Would you like to bring a guest?" he asked. "I would," she said. "Am I the guest you have in mind?" "You are quite sharp for a wheat farmer," she said. "Yes," he said, "I will come to the dinner." She reached out and touched his arm briefly, just a brief pressure of her hand on his sleeve, and then she was looking forward at the street, and he was looking forward at the street, and they were both smiling at the street. The Reverend's dinner was good. There were 6 people, Stokes and his wife, the Aldridges, Lydia and Cyrus, and it was the kind of small gathering that exists specifically to let people talk properly, without the noise of a social or the formality of a church service. Stokes asked Cyrus about his land and about the water situation on the northern properties, which was a genuine concern that year because the dry summer had lowered the water table. And Cyrus talked about it at length with Dr. Aldridge, who had the careful scientific mind of a man who had been educated in the East and chose the frontier because it was more honest. Across the table, Lydia was talking to Reverend Stokes's wife about the school, about her plans for the winter curriculum, about her idea of inviting the parents in once a month to see what the children were learning. Mrs. Stokes was enthusiastic. She was a woman of energy and practical goodwill, and the two of them, Lydia and Mrs. Stokes, were making plans for things that would require the cooperation of the town council by the time the soup course was finished. After dinner in the parlor with the fire going and good coffee and a plate of Mrs. Stokes's gingerbread, Cyrus found himself next to Lydia on the horsehair settee, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and she was telling him quietly about something funny one of the students had said that day, and he was watching her face in the firelight, and the thought that had been building in him for weeks arrived fully formed. He wanted to marry this woman. He turned this thought over carefully in his mind, the way he turned over soil he was assessing, checking for density and substance. It was real. It was not the fever of the first few weeks, but something that had deepened every time he had been with her, and every time he had been away from her and thought about being with her. He wanted to know her for the rest of his life. He wanted to know who she was at 50 and at 70. He wanted to know her in every season, in the July light and in the November gray, and in all the seasons he had not yet lived. He also knew that 6 weeks was very fast and that she had her own life and her own plans and that she had come to Millhaven for a school, not for a husband, and that the most important thing was to be sure before he said anything, because if he said it wrong or too soon he might frighten her, and the thought of frightening her away was the most specific and acute thing he had ever been afraid of. He decided to wait, not long, but to wait until it was the right moment in the right place and he could say it the right way. December came. The first snow came with it, a thin, early snow that did not stick but meant business. The children arrived at school in coats and scarves. Lydia had arranged the schoolhouse with a stove that was properly tended now because Cyrus had come and adjusted the flue, which had been drawing badly, and the schoolhouse was warm and the children were less restless for it. He brought firewood. She did not ask him to. He simply showed up one Saturday morning with a load of split wood on the wagon and stacked it neatly against the side of the schoolhouse, and when she came to the door to see what the sound was, she found him working with the particular focused efficiency of a man doing something that satisfies him deeply. "You did not have to," she said. "I know," he said, "but the school needs it and I had extra." She looked at the pile of neatly stacked wood and then at him. "Come inside for coffee when you are done," she said. He came inside for coffee. She had been working on the next month's lessons, papers spread across the teacher's desk, and the small schoolhouse stove was warm and the December light through the windows was clear and pale, and she made coffee on the stove and they sat at the 2 chairs she kept by the window and drank it. He put down his cup. He looked at the window. He said, without preamble, because with her pretense was not only useless but seemed like a waste of the time they had, "I want to ask you to marry me. I'm not going to ask you today because I do not think it has been long enough yet and I want to do it properly, but I wanted you to know that it is where I am heading so that you are not surprised when I do ask, and so that if it is not something you want you can tell me now." She was very quiet for a moment. He looked at her. She was looking at her coffee cup. "All right," she said. He waited. "I am not going to tell you not to ask," she said, "when you think the time is right." She looked up at him. "I want you to know that." He let out a breath. "But Cyrus," she said carefully, "I want you to understand what you would be taking on. I am not a simple prospect. I have my work which matters to me extremely and which I intend to keep. I have opinions about most things and I say them out loud. I am not," she paused. I have seen women come west and become smaller because the land and the life press down on them and they let it. I will not let it. I want to be understood about that before anything is decided. Lydia, he said, I fell in love with you because of exactly those things, not in spite of them. She looked at him for a long moment, and whatever calculation she was running behind those eyes reached its conclusion, because something in her settled and opened at the same time. In love, she said. Yes, he said. She put down her own cup. I fell in love with you on a Thursday in October, she said. You were explaining creek hydrology to Clara Meacham, and she was looking at you like you were handing her the world, and I thought, this is a man who gives freely. He did not trust himself to say anything immediately. I am in love with you too, she said. I wanted you to know that while we are being honest about things. The December light fell across the schoolhouse floor between them, pale and clear and winter still. He reached across the space between the two chairs and took her hand. They sat like that for a while, in the warm small schoolhouse with the fire going and the coffee growing cold, and outside the Kansas sky was a pewter blue and the prairie was still, and inside was everything. Christmas came to Millhaven with a second snow, a real one this time, 6 inches that transformed the flat land and muffled the town and brought everyone indoors to the warmth of wood stoves and lamp oil and the peculiar closeness of winter. Cyrus spent the holiday at the Stokes' Christmas gathering, which Lydia also attended, and they sat together at the long table and afterward went for a walk in the snow along the main street while the rest of the town was indoors and the world was white and hushed. She told him she had written to her brother in Illinois about Millhaven, about the school. She had not mentioned him specifically, she said. He told her that was sensible given the timing. She said she might have mentioned the Underwood farm and the winter wheat and the view from the North Road at dawn, just in passing, and he said that also sounded sensible. She was laughing when he stopped walking and turned to her. Lydia Cooper, he said. He had learned her middle name from the school board letters which Mrs. Perth had mentioned at the church supper. She blinked. You know my middle name. Mrs. Perth mentioned the school board correspondence. Of course she did. No real irritation, just the dry note. Mrs. Perth mentions everything to everyone. Lydia Cooper, he said again, more slowly. I have been in love with you since the night of the harvest social when you took my hand and told me to stop apologizing and listen to the music. I have had the very great privilege of watching you take a town of strangers and make them people you know. You have made me feel that my life is worth more attention than I have been giving it. I want to give that life to you. Will you marry me? The snow was coming down very lightly, the particular kind of snow that falls straight down without wind, each flake taking its time. It landed in her dark auburn hair. The Christmas lights from the church window fell across the white street between them. Yes, she said, not dramatically, not with tears. Just with that direct clarity of hers, and then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her in the snow on the main street of Millhaven with his face in her hair, and the December wind was still. They stood there for a long time. They were married in February of 1884, on a Saturday when the temperature climbed unexpectedly to something almost gentle, as though the plains had decided to offer a small gift for the occasion. Reverend Stokes performed the ceremony in the church, which was full, because the whole town came, and Lydia wore a dress of ivory wool that she had sewn herself over the winter evenings, and Cyrus wore his best coat and a new shirt Mrs. Stokes had helped him select at Perth's, and when she came down the aisle on the arm of Dr. Aldridge, who had offered because he was the most senior respected man in town without a family obligation to the event, Cyrus felt something happen to his chest that he thought later was the sound of everything that had been careful in him finally letting go. The vows were simple and the ceremony was short, and the celebration afterward was long and warm, and everyone brought food and Thomas Greer, and his sons played and Cyrus danced. He danced with his wife, whom he had married an hour before in the same barn where she had first taken his hand, and he was still not a great dancer, but he was a great deal better than a man who had never danced in his life, and she told him so, and she was smiling that full, unguarded smile that remained the best thing he had ever seen. Billy Harmon watched them from the edge of the floor with the apple core he had been eating, and said to no one in particular, "He is pretty good at that now." Which was, coming from Billy, high praise. Lydia came to the farm. She had her trunk of books and her teaching materials and a box of her mother's sewing things and a houseplant she had been carrying since Missouri that had survived 2 wagon breakdowns and a Kansas winter on the Hartwell boarding house windowsill, and she set the plant on the kitchen windowsill of the Underwood farmhouse and stood back and looked at it there. "That is better," she said. "Yes," said Cyrus, watching her. "It is." She kept teaching. This had been agreed and it was not revisited. She was at the schoolhouse every day. She taught her classes. She implemented her monthly parent visits. She invited Dr. Aldridge to come and speak to the older children about medicine, and invited Cyrus to come back in the spring to teach them about planting. The school board was pleased. The parents were pleased. The children were thriving in the specific way that children thrive when someone genuinely believes in what they are learning. Cyrus ran his farm. Spring came and the winter wheat came up and the sky went from pewter to its full blue and the July light came back. And it was better than ever before because there was someone at the kitchen table in the morning when he came in from the first round of chores. Someone who had coffee made and who looked up from whatever she was reading or marking and said, "How does it look out there?" and meant it, wanted to know. He told her. He told her about the moisture in the soil and the way the wheat was coming, and the state of the fence on the east side, and the behavioral patterns of the fox who had taken up residence near the barn. She listened and asked the precise questions of someone who is genuinely learning a subject, and she knew more about his farm by the end of the first summer than most people learned in years. She was reading to him now, too. In the evenings, when the work was done and the lamplight was yellow and the prairie night was quiet outside, she would read aloud from whatever she was working through, Dickens or Scott, or one of the natural history volumes, and he would listen while he mended something or sharpened tools or simply sat with his eyes closed, and the sound of her voice in the room was something he had no adequate words for. He wrote it down once for her, in one of the small journals he had taken to keeping since she had told him in the schoolhouse that first Tuesday that he had a poet's way of seeing. He described her voice in the lamplight. He described what the farm felt like now. He described October and November and December, and the snow and the Christmas walk and the moment in the schoolhouse with the coffee growing cold. He left the journal on her pillow. She did not say anything about it directly. But the next morning at breakfast, she reached across the table and touched his hand and kept reading whatever she was reading, and did not let go for a long time. Summer burned through and autumn came again, the 2nd September of their acquaintance and the 1st of their marriage, and the wheat came in well. The harvest was good. Millhaven was pleased with itself, and the grain elevator was full, and the fall air had that particular sweetness of abundance well earned. The harvest social came around again. They went together, which was a different thing entirely from going alone and standing by the wall. They went in the door of the grain barn together, and the lantern light was the same amber, and the fiddle was the same voice, and the smell of hay and cider was the same, and Cyrus stood for a moment just inside the door and felt the full weight of what a year could hold. Lydia took his hand. "Shall we?" she said. "We shall," he said. They danced the first waltz. He was better than last year by a considerable margin. He had been practicing in the kitchen on Sunday evenings, because Lydia had kept teaching him and he had kept learning, and the 3 count was second nature now, and his feet trusted the beat, and he could hold her and move with her and actually be present in the dancing, instead of concentrating on the mechanics of it. Thomas Greer's oldest son, seeing them on the floor, shifted immediately into the waltz from whatever jig he had been playing, because Thomas Greer's oldest son had been at the social last year, and had watched this exact couple take their first uncertain steps, and he knew a good thing to play for when he saw it. They danced 3 dances without stopping. Around them, Millhaven danced. the families they knew and the old couples who had been together 40 years, and the young ones who were new to each other. And the lantern light was amber, and the fiddle was sweet, and the October barn smelled of every good harvest thing. And Cyrus Underwood held his wife and turned her through the waltz, and he was thinking about what she had said to him that morning at the kitchen table before they had left for town. She had said, "I have something to tell you, and I want to say it before we go because I will be distracted all evening if I do not." He had put down his coffee. "I am going to have a child," she said. "I spoke with Dr. Aldridge on Thursday." He had been very still for a moment. Then he had stood up from the table and come around to where she was sitting and knelt down and taken her face in his hands, and she had looked at him with those steady eyes that held everything. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "The doctor says everything is as it should be. Late spring, he thinks." "Late spring," he repeated. "May or June," she said, "before the real heat comes in." He stayed kneeling. He was still holding her face. He said, "I do not know how to say what I am feeling." "Then do not say it," she said. "I know anyway." He had kissed her then, in the morning kitchen with the coffee growing cold again, and the October prairie light coming in the window. And she had laughed against his mouth because her coffee was going cold, and it kept happening that way. Now on the barn floor at the harvest social, dancing the third waltz, he was still carrying that morning in him alongside everything else, and the amber light was moving, and Lydia was looking up at him with the full smile, the real one, the one that had done something to the air in a barn a year ago and had been doing it ever since. "You are miles away," she said. "I am right here," he said. "I am exactly here." She tilted her head. "What are you thinking about?" "The July light," he said. She understood immediately because she always understood. "It is October," she said. "I know," he said. "October is better." They danced the rest of the waltz, and then sat and ate pie, and Lydia talked to Widow Beaumont and to Mrs. Stokes about the school's winter plans, and Cyrus talked to Doc Aldridge about the water situation, and to Hank Bellard about the grain prices. And Billy Harmon showed him a carved wooden horse he had made himself, and Cyrus told him it was good work, because it was, and Billy's square chest puffed up with a pride that had nothing to do with trouble. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was the warmest in several years, which was a mercy. Lydia taught through February without difficulty, and when she began to show, she kept teaching, because the school board, after initially murmuring about propriety, was persuaded by Reverend Stokes and Dr. Aldridge, and approximately 75% of the parents of the children in the school, that Lydia Cooper Underwood was the best teacher Millhaven had ever had, and that propriety could accommodate itself to reality. Thank you. She taught her last class on the 15th of May, a Friday, because on the Friday evening her body told her in no uncertain terms that the time was getting close, and there were practical arrangements to make. Dr. Aldridge came on the 22nd of May, a Thursday, which Cyrus had always thought would remain their day, and on the morning of the 23rd of May, 1885, their son was born. He was a large, healthy boy with dark hair, and a set of lungs that made clear from the first that he intended to be heard. Dr. Aldridge pronounced both mother and child in excellent health. Cyrus sat on the edge of the bed and held his wife's hand and looked at his son, who was lying against Lydia's chest and making exploratory sounds at the world, and the feeling in the room was something that had no name in any of the books on their shelf. "What shall we call him?" Lydia asked. Her voice was tired, but the steadiness was absolutely intact. "Whatever you choose," Cyrus said. "No," she said. "Together." He thought about it. "My father was named James," he said. "My father was named William," she said. "James William Underwood," Cyrus said. Lydia looked down at the boy. "James," she said, the name falling into the quiet of the room with a solidity that felt true. "Hello, James." The boy appeared to consider this and then closed his eyes, having apparently decided it was acceptable. Millhaven received the news with the warmth that a small town reserves for its favorites. Martha Finch brought a pie. Mrs. Stokes brought a knitted blanket. The school's parents brought a basket of things they had organized collectively, and which showed both practical generosity and the particular warmth of a community that had claimed Lydia Cooper as one of its own with a speed that told you something about who she was and how she gave herself to the places she chose. Lydia returned to teaching in September, when James was 4 months old, and Mrs. Hartwell, who had become something between a landlady and a grandmother in the way these things sometimes develop, agreed to look after him in the mornings while Cyrus was in the fields. The arrangement was practical, and it was joyful in the way that practical things become when they are full of love. The farm grew. Cyrus added 20 acres in the spring of 1886, good land to the south that had been unworked and had potential. He and Lydia discussed the finances of it together at the kitchen table, with the ledger between them and 2 cups of coffee and the child asleep in the cradle nearby. And she saw the numbers as clearly as he did and agreed it was sound. In the autumn of 1886, James Underwood, 16 months old, took his first steps across the kitchen floor of the farmhouse, 3 wobbling steps from the table leg to his mother's hands, and then sat down with the satisfied look of someone who has accomplished exactly what they set out to do. Cyrus watched this from the doorway and felt the same vertiginous sensation he had felt 100 times since that first evening in the barn, the feeling of life being more than he had thought it would be. Better than he had thought it would be. He had a habit now in the evenings when the lamps were lit and Lydia was reading or marking papers and James was in his cradle, and the prairie outside was still under whatever sky the season provided, of sitting for a moment and simply being aware of where he was. He did not call it thankfulness exactly, though it was that. He called it paying attention. He had been taught, by a woman who took his hand at a harvest social and told him to listen to the music, that paying attention was the most important thing you could do with a life. The journals he had begun filling were becoming a proper record. He wrote about the land and the seasons and the water table and the yield, because those were the things a farmer had to track. He wrote about James's first tooth and first word, a decisive no delivered at breakfast one morning with complete composure. He wrote about the way Lydia looked reading by lamplight and the sound of her laugh and the precise quality of the October light on the day he asked her to marry him. She had found the journals and read them and told him that they were worth more than he knew, that someday James would read them and know his father's mind, and that was a gift beyond price. He thought about that. He thought it was probably true. He kept writing. 3 years after their wedding, in the February of 1887, they had a conversation at the kitchen table about the future of the farm and the future of the school and the future of Millhaven, which was beginning to grow, as the railroad was now firmly established to the east, and there was talk of a branch line running closer to town within the next few years. The conversation became a plan, and the plan involved Cyrus taking on a young hired hand in the spring to help with the additional acreage, which would free him for the work of expanding the orchards, which was something he had wanted to do for years. A proper commercial orchard to supply the towns along the rail line. Lydia had a plan of her own. She wanted to expand the school into 2 rooms, to separate the younger and older children and give each group more specific instruction. She had written to the school board and to the county, and there were funds available if the town committed to matching them, and she had spent 2 months organizing that commitment with the particular focused intensity she brought to any project she genuinely cared about. By spring, both plans were underway. Hank Bellard's youngest son, a capable 19-year-old named Tom, came to work on the Underwood farm in March and proved to be exactly what was needed: willing, steady, willing to learn, and not the kind of person who needed to be managed closely. Cyrus liked him. He taught Tom what he knew about the land the same way Lydia had taught him about the music, by trusting the other person to find their feet. The orchard was planted in a good year. 50 apple trees and 20 pear trees on the south acres, laid out in the careful grid that Cyrus had drawn over 3 winter evenings. It would take years to mature, he told Lydia, but the roots would go deep and it would outlast them. Most of the best things do, she said. In the summer of 1887, Lydia told him at the kitchen table in the early morning that James was going to have a sibling. Cyrus received this news with more composure than the first time, because now he knew what it meant and what was on the other side of the waiting, and he simply took her hand and held it. Their daughter was born in January of 1888, a winter baby, which the doctor had cautioned might be harder, and which was harder, and which was also entirely fine because Lydia was the most composed and determined person in any room she occupied, and this room was no exception. The girl arrived on a Tuesday morning when the prairie was white and still and the farmhouse was warm with the iron stove burning. They named her Clara for the small student from the creek walk in the first October. "She deserves a good name," Lydia said, in the exhausted and absolutely clear voice of someone who has just done an enormous thing well. "She is going to be exactly like you," Cyrus said. Lydia considered this. "I hope so," she said. "I hope she has your eyes, though." James, 3 years old, was introduced to his sister by Cyrus that morning while Lydia rested, and he studied Clara with the grave and uncertain expression of someone who has been told to expect something and is not sure yet what he thinks of it. Then he touched her hand very carefully with one finger, and she curled her hand around his finger the way newborns do, automatic and unknowing, and James Underwood looked up at his father with an expression of complete astonishment and said, "She held me." "Yes," Cyrus said, "she did." The fourth harvest social after Lydia's arrival in Millhaven was a particular one. It was September 1887. Clara was 8 months old and at home with Mrs. Hartwell for the evening, and James was with the Stokes children under the supervision of Mrs. Stokes, and Cyrus and Lydia came to the barn alone together, as they had come every year since their marriage, in the way that was now simply theirs. They were expected. People looked up when they came in the door with the kind of warm recognition that meant something in a community, the kind that acknowledged a couple as a fact of the place, woven in. Thomas Greer's family played. Thomas Greer himself was a little slower now, letting his sons carry more, but he was there and his fiddle was the same. And when Cyrus and Lydia took the floor, the music shifted into the waltz with the timing that said it was deliberate, and there was laughter from the crowd and the kind of good-natured applause that means affection. They danced. They danced well, the two of them, the way people dance who have danced together hundreds of times in a kitchen and know each other's rhythm in the bones. He led and she followed, and he turned her under the amber lanterns, and the barn smelled of harvest and cider, and her hair smelled of the soap she used at the kitchen basin, and he thought about a man who had stood against the wall for 6 years because the music had not been his. He pulled her slightly closer and said against her ear, "Do you remember the first time?" "I stepped on your feet," she said. "Once." "You stepped on mine 4 times. 3, he said. "The last one was a near miss." She pulled back to look at him with laughter in her eyes, because he had remembered exactly what she had said a year ago, and he had been saving it. And she knew that, and she laughed the quick, unguarded laugh that had gone somewhere into him that first night and never come back out. They danced until the fiddle slowed, and then they sat with their friends and neighbors and ate Martha Finch's 2 sweet cider and the abundant contributions of the harvest table. And Billy Harmon, now a young man of 14 with the beginnings of his father's build and a considerably reduced interest in nailing doors shut, came to show Cyrus a new piece of wood carving, a detailed horse this time, with careful attention to the legs, and Cyrus told him honestly that it was fine work. "You should sell those," Lydia told Billy, "at the general store or at the station when the rail comes in." Billy Harmon blinked. "You think people would buy them?" "I know they would," she said. "That horse is better than anything in Perth's window right now." Billy Harmon went home that evening with the particular expression of someone who has been handed the beginning of a future they had not previously imagined, which was, Cyrus thought, exactly what she did, not just for the children in the schoolroom, but for everyone she turned her attention toward. He said this to her on the drive home under the September stars, James asleep across her lap, and the night around them cool and enormous and quiet. "You do that," he said. "You hand people the beginning of something." She turned to look at him in the dark. "You do too," she said. "You have done it for me." He kept his eyes on the road. "I have tried to." "You have succeeded," she said simply. The orchard's first serious fruit came in the autumn of 1890, 6 years after they had married, 3 years after planting. A modest but real first yield of apples from the South Acres, more than enough for the farm and for selling at the Millhaven General Store, and as it turned out, at the station when the branch railroad did indeed arrive in 1889, bringing new settlers and new commerce, and a version of Millhaven that was larger and louder than the one Lydia had walked into on a September night in 1883. The town changed. The plains changed. Settlers came in on the rail, and the land that had been open became claimed. There were conflicts, some of which Millhaven weathered, and some of which it did not. And the business of the West in those years was complicated and not always fair. And Cyrus saw the way new people came onto land that had been occupied and used in ways the law did not protect. And he was not able to fix those things, but he could see them clearly, and he could say, when it mattered, what he saw. There was a family named Running Cloud who had lived and ranched along the Southern Creek for as long as anyone in Millhaven could remember. A mixed family, part Kaw and part white, who held their land through a title that was technically solid but practically vulnerable in the way of all titles held by people outside the protected center of a community. When a land agent came through in 1891 with paperwork that was genuinely questionable, and a speed that was intended to prevent careful examination, it was Cyrus who went to the land office and asked the agent to wait, and it was Lydia who wrote letters to 2 different lawyers in Topeka, and between them, drawing on the goodwill of a community they had spent years building, they slowed things down enough for the title to be properly examined and found valid. The Running Cloud family kept their land. It was not a heroic act. It was just the act of paying attention, which was, Lydia had taught him, the most important thing. James was 10 years old when this happened, old enough to understand what his parents had done and why, and he asked his father about it afterward, sitting on the porch in the October evening. "Why did you help them?" James asked. "Because it was right," Cyrus said, "and because someone who lets an injustice happen when they could have acted has made a choice, even if they pretend they have not." James considered this with the grave attention of a boy who takes things seriously. He had his mother's eyes, steady and clear, and his father's quality of stillness. "Mama says things like that," he said. "Your mother is almost always right," Cyrus said. "That is something you should learn early." James nodded as though filing this for future reference. Clara, at 3, appeared at the door with a piece of her mother's bread and butter, which she had obtained from the kitchen apparently without supervision, and climbed into Cyrus's lap with the complete confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt her welcome anywhere. "You are supposed to be inside," Cyrus told her. "Bread," she said, by way of explanation, and offered him a bite. He took it. James accepted some too. They sat on the porch in the evening with the prairie quiet around them and the lamp in the kitchen making a yellow rectangle of warmth in the window. And inside that light Lydia was visible at the table, bent over her papers, doing what she always did in the evenings, preparing for the next day's teaching with the same focused dedication she had brought to it from the first. Cyrus watched her for a moment through the window. She looked up, sensing his eyes, and looked out through the glass at the porch where he sat with their children, and she smiled at him in the lamplight, the full smile, the one that was still the best thing. He smiled back. The years built themselves one on another, each season adding to the ones before, the orchard growing toward its full production, the farm extending and improving, the children growing into themselves in the particular ways of children who are well loved and well taught and given room to become what they are. The school became 2 rooms in 1889, as Lydia had planned, and she trained a second teacher, a young woman from Ohio, to run the younger grades while she took the older ones. By 1893, the farm was prospering, and the orchard was beginning to reach its intended yield. The branch railroad meant there was a market for the apples that the local trade alone could not have supported, and Tom Bellard, still working the farm with the steady competence he had shown from the first, had become something between an employee and a partner. Cyrus drew up the partnership formally, because Tom had earned it, and because Lydia said that formalizing what was already true was the honest thing to do. That year they also repainted the farmhouse, inside and out, because the white clapboard had weathered 10 years of prairie wind and was beginning to show it. They chose the same white because it was right for the house, and while they were at it, Cyrus added a porch room at the back with a window that faced the orchard, because the orchard was beautiful in the mornings now, the way the July light came through the apple leaves, and Lydia had mentioned once that she would like a room where she could see it. He did not tell her about the room until it was finished. He took her hand one October morning and brought her around to the back of the house, where the new porch room was, with its window looking south over the apple trees, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the light in the leaves, and she was quiet for a moment. "You remembered," she said. "I always remember," he said. She turned and put her arms around him right there in the new doorway with the orchard morning light coming in, and held on for a long moment. "You have been giving me things since the beginning," she said quietly. "Good things, the kind that last." "You gave them to me first," he said. "You took my hand." She drew back enough to look at him. She was 40 now, or would be in the spring, and the years had given her something that had always been there in outline and was now complete, a settled quality, a sureness that was different from the composed self-possession of the young woman who had walked into a harvest barn alone and surveyed the room. This was deeper. This was a woman who knew her ground. He was 38. He had the gray beginning at his temples that happened early in the Underwood men, and the particular quality of stillness that had always been his had become something else over 10 years of marriage and fathering and farming and paying attention. It had become peace. "I took your hand," she said, "and you held it." "I have been holding it ever since," he said. The October light came through the new window and fell across the floor of the porch room in a long pale rectangle. Outside, the apple trees stood in their rows, mature and generous, full of the season's last fruit. Cyrus Underwood thought about a man who had stood against the wall of a harvest barn for 6 years, because the music had not been his, and the dancing was not something he had ever done, and the life he had been living had been a good life by the measures of survival and work and quiet endurance. He thought about what it had cost to take that hand. Nothing, in the end. Just the courage to step off the wall. He thought about everything on the other side of that step. His wife, his children, his land, his place in this community, the journals full of October light and water tables and the sound of laughter in a farmhouse kitchen. The stone gone from his boot, the music making sense, the feet finally trusting themselves. "James asked me last week," Lydia said, still in the circle of his arms, "how we met." "What did you tell him?" "I told him there was a harvest social and I needed someone to dance with," she said, "and you were there." "I was not going to dance," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the part I did not tell him." "I thought I would let him believe you wanted to." He laughed, a quiet laugh into her hair. "I did want to," he said. "By the end I did." "By the end you were very good," she said. "Adequate," he said. "There is a difference." "There is a difference," she agreed, and he could feel her smiling against his shoulder, "but it closes with practice." He held on to her in the morning light of the room he had built because she had mentioned once that she wanted to see the orchard. Outside, the apple trees were red and gold with the harvest season, the same colors as the lanterns in the grain barn on the night that had changed everything. The prairie beyond was broad and flat and going on forever, the way it did, the way it had always done. He thought, "I have learned to dance. I have learned to pay attention. I have learned that a life kept carefully for its own sake is still a closed room until someone takes your hand." He had never danced in his life until she took his hand at the harvest social. And in one evening he had learned not just the steps, but what the music was for. James Underwood, running around the side of the house chasing Clara, skidded to a stop at the back porch, and looked at his parents standing in the new room's doorway with the ease of two people who have not let go of each other in a decade. "Are you coming to breakfast?" James demanded. "We are coming to breakfast," Cyrus said. "Mama promised biscuits," Clara added, arriving at her brother's side with the same compressed energy of a child who runs at everything. "I did promise biscuits," Lydia confirmed and stepped back from Cyrus's arms without hurry, keeping his hand in hers, and looked at her children in the October morning light. "Well," she said, "let us not waste the morning." She pulled him gently toward the kitchen, and he went, willingly, as he had always gone when she took his hand, and the door of the new room swung open behind them in the October breeze. And through its window, the orchard stood in its rows, patient and rooted and full of the season's abundance. And the light in the apple leaves was better than July and better than the amber lanterns of a harvest barn, because this was their light, grown on their land. In a life they had made together from the moment she had held out her hand and said simply, "Trust mine," he had, he did, he would.